There is a moment, quiet and almost unremarkable, that happens to nearly every person alive. It happens when you are standing in front of a mirror early in the morning, or lying in bed just before sleep pulls you under, or sitting alone in a car after a long day that did not go the way you hoped. It is that moment when something inside you whispers, "I am not where I want to be." And the terrifying, beautiful, life-altering truth is that this whisper is not a curse. It is an invitation. It is the first knock on the door of everything you were always meant to become. Frank Crane knew that whisper. He lived through it, wrestled with it, and eventually turned it into a philosophy so clear, so grounded, and so deeply human that it has outlasted generations of complexity and noise. Crane was not a man who dealt in abstractions. He was a minister, a columnist, a thinker who wrote for ordinary people. People who worked with their hands, people who lay awake worried about tomorrow, people who wanted to do better but were not entirely sure where to begin. And what he gave them, in a book called Resolve to Win, was not a trick or a formula or a shortcut. What he gave them was a way of seeing. This summary is for you, whether you have read the book or never heard of it. It is for the person who feels stuck, who feels like the life they imagined is somehow just slightly out of reach, who suspects that maybe, just maybe, something in their thinking needs to shift before anything in their circumstances can change. Crane believed that winning, true winning, the kind that leaves you satisfied at the end of a life well lived, was not about talent or luck or timing. It was about resolution. It was about the decision, made again and again, to move forward with intention. So let us walk through this together. Let us take what Crane wrote and breathe some life into it, add some stories along the way, and let it settle into you the way good ideas always do, not like a thunderclap, but like a slow, steady light that grows brighter the longer you sit with it. Frank Crane begins with something that sounds almost too simple to be useful. He begins with the idea that what you think determines everything, not everything in the sense of magic, not in the sense that you can wish your way to success while sitting still, but in the sense that your inner world shapes your outer one in ways that are real, measurable, and constant. The person who wakes up every morning believing the day will be difficult usually manages to find enough difficulty to confirm that belief. The person who wakes up expecting something good, who carries a certain quiet confidence that there is something worth finding in the hours ahead, tends to find that too. This is not mysticism. This is just how attention works. You find what you look for. And Crane was insistent that most people never stop to examine what they are actually looking for. They drift, they react, they respond to whatever life throws at them without ever having made the decision about what kind of life they want to live. And that absence of decision is itself a decision. To not choose is to choose. To not resolve is to resolve, just not in any direction that serves you. There was a man, not anyone famous, just someone whose stories circulated in the circles Frank Crane moved in. A tradesman from a small town who had spent the better part of 20 years complaining about his circumstances. He complained about the economy, about his neighbors, about the fact that better educated men had gotten the opportunities he deserved. He was not without intelligence. He was not without ability. But every morning he rose with a list of grievances already assembled, and every night he went to bed having added a few more. One day, after an illness that kept him confined to bed for 3 weeks with nothing to do but think, he made a decision. He decided, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, that he was going to stop counting what was against him and start counting what was for him. It felt ridiculous at first. There was not much on the list. He was healthy, now that the illness had passed. He had a trade. He had 2 good hands. He had a clear head when he chose to use it. That was enough. Something shifted. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a ship shifts course by only a degree or two and ends up miles later in an entirely different harbor. Crane would have recognized that man. He wrote about him, or people like him, constantly. The resolution to see differently was, in Crane's view, the foundational act of a winning life. Before you resolve to work harder, before you resolve to be kinder, before you resolve to read more or sleep better or save more money, you have to resolve to see clearly. You have to decide that you will look at your life honestly, without the comfortable fog of self-pity or the false brightness of denial, and that you will work with what is actually there. And what Crane found, over years of writing and ministry and conversation with thousands of ordinary people, was that what was actually there was almost always more than people believed. The gap between where a person was and where they could be was rarely a gap of resources or intelligence or circumstance. It was almost always a gap of vision. People simply could not see themselves succeeding, and so they never really aimed for it. The second great theme that runs through Resolve to Win is the idea of effort, not as punishment, not as the price you reluctantly pay for the life you want, but as the very thing that gives life its texture and meaning. Crane was writing at a time when many people were beginning to romanticize ease. The early 20th century had brought with it a wave of mechanical invention, and there was a growing sense that perhaps human effort was becoming obsolete, that machines would do the hard work and people would simply enjoy the fruits. Crane saw the danger in this, not the economic danger, though that was real, but the spiritual danger, the danger of a life without struggle. He wrote, and this is worth sitting with, that a person who has never worked hard for something has never fully possessed anything. There is a difference between having something handed to you and earning it, not a moral difference, not a judgment, but an experiential difference. The thing you earned is yours in a way the thing you were given never quite can be. You understand it differently, you value it differently, and when it is threatened, you protect it differently. The person who built something from nothing knows exactly which screws to tighten when the structure begins to wobble, because they put those screws in themselves. This does not mean that Crane was indifferent to generosity or to help. He was not. He believed deeply in community, in the way people lift each other, in the beauty of a hand extended to someone who was stumbling. But he made a distinction that is worth making carefully, the distinction between help that enables and help that diminishes. Real help, Crane argued, always increases a person's capacity to do for themselves. False help, however well-intentioned, takes something away. It steals the opportunity for growth that only comes from having to figure something out. Think about a time when you struggled with something, genuinely struggled, when the answer did not come easily and you had to sit with the problem until something in you found the solution. Do you remember how that felt? Not just the relief of solving it, but something deeper, a kind of quiet satisfaction, a sense that you had proven something to yourself. That is what Crane was pointing at. That is what he did not want people to miss. The struggle is not an obstacle to the good life. In many ways, the struggle is the good life. And yet, Crane was careful not to romanticize suffering for its own sake. He was not one of those writers who believed that misery was noble or that difficulty was always instructive. Some hardship is simply hardship. Some pain is simply pain. The question is not whether you suffer, but what you do with the suffering when it arrives. And here his philosophy became particularly interesting. He believed that the resolution to win did not mean the resolution never to lose. It meant the resolution to learn from every loss, to extract something useful from every failure, to treat setback not as a stop sign but as a detour that might, if followed with enough intelligence and good humor, lead somewhere better than the original route. There is a story that captures this beautifully. A young woman in the early part of the last century had trained for years to be a concert pianist. She was gifted. Her teachers believed in her. Her family had sacrificed for her lessons. And then, at 23, she developed a condition in her right hand that made sustained performance painful and eventually impossible. It was, by any reasonable measure, a catastrophe. The life she had prepared for was closed to her. She spent some months in genuine grief, which was appropriate and necessary. But then, slowly, she began to look at what remained. She could still hear. She could still understand music at a level most people never achieve. She began to teach. And over the following decades, she shaped the playing of dozens of students, several of whom went on to distinguished careers she could no longer pursue herself. She never stopped grieving the career she lost. But she built something in its place that, by the end of her life, she would not have traded for anything. Crane would have told her story with deep feeling. Not because the ending was tidy, it was not entirely tidy, she carried a real loss all her life. But because what she demonstrated was the core of what he meant by resolution. She kept choosing. Even after the hardest door closed, she kept choosing to open the next one. Moving deeper into what Crane wrote, we come to his thoughts on character. And here he was at his most compelling and also, perhaps, his most challenging. Because Crane believed that character was not something you either had or did not have. It was something you built deliberately, the way you build a house, one brick at a time, over a long period of work. And the bricks, the actual material of character, were habits, small habits, repeated daily, that accumulated into something solid and lasting. He was specific about this in ways that modern readers sometimes find surprising. He talked about punctuality, about keeping your word on small matters, about the way you speak to people who cannot do anything for you, about whether you tell the truth when it would be easier and more comfortable to shade it slightly, about whether you do the work that needs doing before you do the work you enjoy. These sound, taken individually, like modest virtues, but Crane's point was that they were not modest at all. They were the substance of a person. They were the thing other people actually experienced when they experienced you. And more than that, they were the thing you experienced when you experienced yourself. This is where Crane's writing becomes almost painfully honest. He knew, from his years of ministry and from his own interior life, how easy it is to have a high opinion of yourself based on who you intend to be rather than who you actually are. He knew the comfortable gap between the self-image and the actual self, and he was gentle but unyielding in his insistence that the gap had to be closed, not by lowering the self-image, but by raising the actual behavior. He wrote about a man who was universally liked, charming at dinner parties, generous with compliments, capable of great warmth in social situations. But at home, with his family, he was impatient. He was careless with promises. He said he would be somewhere and then was not. He said he would do something and then forgot. And the people who loved him most, who had no access to his public warmth, knew a different person. Crane used this to make a point that stings a little, even now. He said that the measure of your character is not how you behave when you are being watched and admired. It is how you behave when the only witness is someone who already loves you unconditionally, and whom you know will forgive you regardless, because that is where the truth lives. That is where the actual self, unperformed and unpolished, reveals itself. The invitation in this is not to shame yourself about the gap. The invitation is to close it. To decide that you want to be in private the person you want to be in public, not because someone is watching, but because the consistency itself, the alignment between your inner life and your outer behavior, is what produces the feeling most people spend their lives chasing and never quite finding. That feeling of integrity, that feeling of being whole. Crane was also, and this is something that gets overlooked in discussions of his work, a deeply practical thinker about relationships. He believed that how you treat other people was not a separate category from how you lived your life. It was the central category. The resolution to win was never, in his understanding, a resolution to win at the expense of others. It was a resolution to win in a way that brought others along, that created more good in the world than you consumed, that left people better for having known you. He wrote about friendship with unusual depth. He said that most people have many acquaintances and very few friends, and that this is not a failure of social skill but a failure of investment. Real friendship requires something from you. It requires showing up when it is inconvenient. It requires telling the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable. It requires a willingness to be seen in your difficulty, not just in your strength, and to allow others to be seen in theirs. This vulnerability, this mutual exposure, is what transforms acquaintance into something worth having. And he wrote with equal seriousness about the damage done by certain kinds of relationships, the ones that pull you toward smallness rather than toward growth. He was not advocating cruelty or sudden abandonment of people who needed help, but he was clear that you will, over time, become some version of the people you spend the most time with. The energy in a room is real. The assumptions shared by a group shape what its members believe is possible. And if you are surrounded by people who have given up, who mock ambition, who treat hope as naive, something in you will begin to absorb that. Not because you are weak, but because you are human. The resolution here is to be intentional, to choose your inner circle with care, to seek out people who are, in Crane's phrase, going somewhere, people whose lives are evidence that the things you believe in are actually achievable. This does not mean surrounding yourself with people who are more successful than you in material terms. It means surrounding yourself with people who are more alive, more curious, more committed to growth, whose company makes you feel more like yourself at your best. Around the 10-minute mark of sitting with these ideas, something tends to happen. The initial enthusiasm of a new idea begins to settle into something more complicated. Because you start to think about the actual application. You start to think about your actual life, with its actual demands and actual complications, and wonder how any of this translates. Crane anticipated this. He knew that philosophy, no matter how beautiful, becomes useless the moment it loses contact with the ground. And so he wrote with great care about the practical mechanics of living a resolved life. By the way, if this summary is speaking to you, if it is giving you something to think about and something to feel, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. Every subscription helps this channel grow, helps more people find these ideas, and allows us to keep bringing you content like this. It genuinely makes a difference, and we are grateful for every single person who takes that moment to support what we are building here. Now, back to Crane's practicality. He wrote about mornings. He was a great believer in the first hour of the day, as the hour that set the tone for everything that followed. Not because of any particular ritual. He was not prescriptive about whether you should meditate or exercise or journal, but because of the attitude you brought to that first hour. He believed that most people let the day happen to them rather than deciding, at the outset, what they wanted the day to be. They woke up and immediately allowed the noise of the world, the demands, the news, the worry to fill the space before they had a chance to fill it themselves. And then they spent the rest of the day reacting instead of creating. His prescription was simple. Begin the day by reminding yourself what you are about, what you are working toward, what matters to you. Not in a way that is rigid or programmatic, not with a list that has to be checked off before you can feel okay, but in a way that is quiet and orienting. The way a compass orients. Just a moment of knowing which direction is north. He also wrote about failure, at length and with enormous compassion, which is one of the things that makes Resolve to Win different from many books that deal with similar themes. He did not treat failure as the enemy. He treated it as a teacher, one who is often harsh but rarely wrong. Every failure, he believed, contains within it a specific lesson that cannot be learned any other way. The question is whether you are willing to do the uncomfortable work of extracting that lesson rather than simply moving on, or worse, staying stuck in regret. He told a story, or referenced one, about a businessman who had failed spectacularly, lost everything, a business that had taken a decade to build, gone in a matter of months because of a combination of bad timing, a partner who turned out to be dishonest, and his own overconfidence. He was 50 years old when it happened. Many people in his life told him, quietly or not so quietly, that it was over, that starting again at 50 was unrealistic, that he should find something smaller, safer, more appropriate to his age and his situation. He did not listen. He spent 6 months doing something that looked like nothing to the people around him. He was, as they saw it, simply quiet, but what he was actually doing was thinking. He was going back through every decision he had made in the years leading up to the collapse and asking himself honestly what he would have done differently. He was mapping his own mistakes with a kind of ruthless tenderness, tender enough not to destroy himself with guilt, ruthless enough not to let himself off the hook for things that were genuinely his responsibility. And then he built again. Smaller at first, more carefully. With partners he chose more wisely and contracts he read more thoroughly. By the time he was 60, he had built something that was not what he had lost but was, in certain ways, more satisfying. Because he understood it better, because he had earned it differently. Crane's point was not that this always happens, that failure always leads to something better. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes the loss is just a loss. But the person who approaches their failure with honest reflection and genuine resolution is always better positioned to try again than the person who explains their failure entirely by pointing at external forces. Not because external forces are never real, they often are, but because external forces are, by definition, outside your control. And Crane was relentlessly focused on what was inside your control. This brings us to one of the most important concepts in the book, the distinction between what Crane called the outer life and the inner life. The outer life is everything visible, your job, your relationships, your home, your reputation, your bank account. The inner life is everything that produces those things, your thoughts, your beliefs, your habits, your character. And Crane's central argument, the one that everything else in the book orbits around, is that most people are trying to fix the outer life without ever touching the inner one. They change jobs without changing their relationship to work. They change partners without changing their patterns in relationship. They move to a new city carrying exactly the same assumptions that made the old city feel limiting. The scenery shifts, but the story stays the same, because the author has not changed. The resolution to win, at its deepest level, is the resolution to work on the inner life with the same energy and discipline you would bring to any important outer project. It is the resolution to examine your beliefs and be willing to change the ones that are not serving you. It is the resolution to understand your own patterns well enough to choose differently. It is the resolution, and this is perhaps the hardest part, to be honest with yourself even when honesty is uncomfortable. Crane was not naive about how hard this is. He knew that self-knowledge is not a destination but a practice. He knew that the most honest person in the world still has blind spots, still has areas where they tell themselves comfortable stories rather than true ones. The point is not to achieve perfect self-knowledge, which is probably impossible, but to be continuously moving toward greater clarity, to be always willing to question your own assumptions, always willing to say, perhaps I was wrong about that, and to update. There is something quietly radical about this in a culture that rewards certainty. We celebrate people who project confidence, who never seem to doubt, who always have an answer ready. But Crane believed that the person who never doubts is not strong. They are brittle. They have built their sense of self on being right, and so any evidence that they might be wrong becomes a threat to their identity rather than an opportunity for growth. The truly resolved person, in Crane's view, is the one who can hold their beliefs firmly enough to act on them, and loosely enough to change them when better evidence arrives. He wrote about this in the context of learning. He was a passionate advocate for continuous learning throughout life, not formal education necessarily, though he valued that too, but the habit of paying attention to the world with genuine curiosity. Reading, asking questions, being interested in people whose experiences were different from your own, visiting places that challenged your assumptions, staying, as he put it, in a state of becoming rather than a state of having already arrived. This resonated deeply because one of the quiet tragedies he observed again and again was people who stopped learning not because they had learned everything, but because they had decided they knew enough. They had reached a point of comfort or competence and had confused it with completion. And from that point forward, the world continued to change, continued to offer new information, continued to become more complex and interesting, while they stood still, certain, and slowly, without realizing it, falling behind. The resolution to keep learning is not glamorous. It does not produce immediate visible results. It is the resolution to read the book when you could watch something easier. It is the resolution to ask the question when you could nod and pretend to understand. It is the resolution to admit, in front of other people, that you do not know something, which requires a particular kind of courage in a world that mistakes ignorance for weakness. Crane also spent considerable time on what he called the discipline of attention. He meant by this the ability to be fully present to what you are doing, to bring your whole self to the task at hand, rather than half of yourself while the other half is somewhere else. He saw distraction as one of the great enemies of a resolved life, not the distraction of noise and interruption, though those were real, but the inner distraction of a mind that cannot settle. He noticed that many people lived their lives in a kind of permanent elsewhere. When they were at work, they were thinking about home. When they were at home, they were thinking about work. When they were with their children, they were mentally composing the email they needed to send. When they were with their spouse, they were reviewing the conversation they had had that afternoon with a difficult colleague. And so the actual moments of their lives passed through them without being inhabited, without being experienced, without being lived. The resolution to pay attention, really pay attention, to what is happening in the present moment is, Crane argued, one of the most powerful things a person can do. Not because the present moment is always pleasant, it often is not, but because it is always real. And a life lived in reality, however imperfect, is always more nourishing than a life lived in imagination, however comfortable. He told a story about two men who took the same walk through the same park every morning for 20 years. At the end of those 20 years, one of them could describe the park in extraordinary detail. He could tell you when the cherry trees bloomed, which benches faced east, where the sparrows nested in spring. He had accumulated 20 years of mornings in that park. The other man could tell you that there was a park near his office where he sometimes walked. He had been there, certainly, but he had been elsewhere while being there, and the park had passed through him like water through a sieve. Crane was not advocating for a particular pace of life or a particular kind of mindfulness. He was making a simpler and more essential point. The life you are living is happening now, not in the future when conditions are better, not in the past, which cannot be changed, now. And the degree to which you are present to it is the degree to which you are actually living it. The middle sections of Resolve to Win deal extensively with work, with the relationship between a person and their vocation, and here Crane said things that were considered unusual for his time and that remain in certain ways unusual now. He rejected the idea that work was simply a means to an end, a necessary unpleasantness that you endured in exchange for the things that actually mattered. He believed that work, at its best, was itself one of the things that mattered, that the doing of something skillfully, the application of intelligence and effort and care to a task, was a form of living well. But he was careful to distinguish between work that was simply busyness, the performance of activity without genuine engagement, and work that was what he called purposeful. Purposeful work, in his definition, was work that was connected to something you cared about, that used your actual capacities rather than just filling your time, that left the world in some small way better than it was before you started. He was not romantic about this. He knew that not everyone had the luxury of working in a field they loved. He knew that many people worked hard at things they did not particularly enjoy in order to support lives and families they cared about deeply. He honored that. He saw the love embedded in that kind of unglamorous sacrifice. But even within constrained circumstances, he believed that a person could bring something to their work that transformed the quality of it. They could bring attention. They could bring craftsmanship, the desire to do the thing well rather than merely adequately. They could bring kindness to the people they encountered in the course of their work. They could bring integrity to every transaction and interaction. These things did not require a different job. They required a different relationship to the job that existed. He wrote about a man who worked in a factory. on a line that produced the same component, thousands of times a day, in conditions that were monotonous and physically taxing. This man could easily have been defined by the smallness of his job, but he had decided at some point that he was going to be the best at what he did. Not for recognition, not because anyone was watching and would reward him, but because he had decided that the quality of his attention was something that belonged to him, something no one could take away. He became extraordinary at something ordinary, and in doing so he preserved something in himself that factory life could easily have eroded, his sense of being an agent in his own life, not just a body performing a function. Crane returned to this idea many times across the book, the idea that the resolution to win is not primarily about winning in the external, competitive sense. It is about maintaining your aliveness, your engagement, your sense of being a person who is actively participating in the making of their own life, rather than simply watching it happen. He wrote about joy, and he was insistent that joy was not a luxury, not something you earned after you had done everything else right, but a discipline and a choice. He distinguished joy from pleasure, which is passive and dependent on external circumstances, and from happiness, which he associated with a kind of continuous emotional high that was neither realistic nor particularly desirable. Joy, as he understood it, was quieter and more durable. It was the satisfaction of being engaged with your life, of caring about things, of being moved by beauty, of finding in ordinary moments something worth noticing. He was troubled by people who postponed joy, who said that they would enjoy their lives after the mortgage was paid, after the children were raised, after they retired, after some future condition was met that would finally grant them permission to feel good about being alive. He saw this postponement as one of the great wastes of human existence, because the future, when it arrived, had its own set of conditions that needed meeting before joy could begin. And so joy never quite arrived. The person lived through decades of their actual life waiting for the life to start, the resolution to experience joy now, in the imperfect, incomplete, still-in-progress life you are actually living, was, for Crane, not a small thing. It was an act of courage. It was the refusal to treat your existence as a rehearsal for something that might come later. He wrote beautifully about gratitude, not as a performance, not as the practice of listing things you are thankful for in a formulaic way, but as a genuine orientation toward life that recognized what was good and treated it with appropriate reverence. He believed that in gratitude, the habit of taking good things for granted while amplifying bad ones was both spiritually corrosive and practically counterproductive. The person who cannot see what is going well in their life cannot protect it and cannot build on it. They are navigating without a map of their assets. But gratitude, done honestly, opens your eyes to what is actually there, and when you can see clearly what you have, you are much better positioned to use it well. He told a story here about a woman who had, by any external measure, a difficult life. She had lost her husband young. She had raised 4 children largely on her own. She had worked hard in jobs that were demanding and not particularly well paid to keep a household going. But she was, by the testimony of everyone who knew her, one of the most joyful people they had ever encountered. Not cheerful in a shallow way, not relentlessly positive in a way that denied reality, but genuinely, sustainably happy. And when people asked her about it, she would say, always, that she had learned early that the world owed her nothing and had given her so much. That she had children who were alive. That she had work that gave her structure. That she had a few friends who knew her truly. That most mornings there was light in the window and something warm to drink. That was enough. That was more than enough. Crane was moved by people like this. He held them up not as examples of settling or of lowering expectations, but as examples of accurate seeing. The woman was not pretending her losses were not real. She knew they were. She had grieved them honestly, but she had also decided not to let the losses define the whole. She had decided to count what remained, and what remained was considerable. This is perhaps the most countercultural thing in resolve to win. In a world that is constantly telling you that you need more, that what you have is not quite enough, that the next thing, the next level, the next acquisition will finally satisfy. Crane was saying that the capacity to be satisfied, genuinely satisfied, with what is not a failure of ambition. It is a form of wisdom. It is the recognition that the purpose of the striving is not to arrive somewhere other than here, but to become someone more fully alive to here. He did not mean by this that you should stop growing. He believed in growth more deeply than almost anything, but he believed that growth should be in the service of aliveness, not in the service of escape. The person who is always striving in order to get away from where they are will never arrive anywhere that feels like home. The person who is growing in order to become more fully themselves, who is adding to a life they already find worth living, that person is building something real. Crane's writing on the relationship between the individual and the community was rich and worth dwelling on. He believed, deeply, that no one wins alone. That every person who achieves something of genuine worth does so in the context of a web of relationships, influences, teachings, and support that they did not create themselves. The self-made person, in the absolute sense, does not exist. Everyone was made by something, by someone, by the accumulated wisdom of people who lived and thought before them. This was not an argument against individual achievement. It was an argument for humility and for a sense of responsibility that flows from gratitude. If you have received something, you owe something. Not to any particular person, not necessarily in any formal way, but to the ongoing project of human civilization and human well-being. You are, whether you acknowledge it or not, a link in a chain. And the question of what that link is made of, whether it is strong or weak, whether it adds to the integrity of the chain or diminishes it, is one of the most important questions of your life. He wrote about mentorship with great warmth. He believed that the passing of wisdom from those who have lived more to those who have lived less was one of the most sacred human activities. And he mourned the ways in which modern life, even the modern life of his time, was making this harder. The fragmentation of communities, the loss of the extended family as a living structure. The way in which people move frequently, beginning again constantly, never developing the depth of connection that comes from long association. His prescription was simple and difficult at once. Stay somewhere long enough to matter. Invest in relationships long enough to have them actually form. Trust people enough to be known. Be patient with the slow work of genuine connection, which cannot be hurried and cannot be manufactured, but which, when it exists, is one of the most sustaining things a human life can contain. He also wrote about forgiveness, and here his pastoral background was most evident. He had seen, in decades of ministry, what happened to people who could not forgive. They became smaller. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over time, the unprocessed grievance took up space that should have been available for living. It calcified. It became a kind of identity, the person who was wronged, the person whose injury was the organizing fact of their existence. And from that position, growth was very nearly impossible. Crane was not saying that the injuries were not real. He was not saying that what was done to people who had been treated badly was acceptable or that it did not matter. He was saying that the decision to forgive, which is in no way the same as the decision to forget or to pretend it did not happen, was a decision you made for yourself. It was the decision to take back the energy that was being spent on the grievance and use it for something that actually served your life. Forgiveness, in this reading, was not a gift to the person who had wronged you. It was a gift to yourself. He told a story about two brothers who had a falling out over something that began, as so many family conflicts do, with something fairly small, a misunderstanding about their mother's estate, a perceived slight at a family gathering, a word said in anger that was not taken back soon enough. The conflict grew, the way unaddressed conflicts do, accreting new grievances the way a snowball accretes snow. They stopped speaking. Years passed. Both of them carried the weight of it in ways they probably did not fully acknowledge even to themselves. And then one of them became ill, seriously ill, the kind of illness that clarifies things. And the other one, who had been the aggrieved party, who had the stronger case, who had been genuinely wronged in the original dispute, showed up. He showed up because something in him recognized that the story they had been telling, the story in which they were adversaries, was less true than the story in which they were brothers. And that the time for living in the less true story was running out. They did not suddenly become best friends. The complexity of a long estrangement cannot be dissolved by a single visit. But something opened. Something that had been closed began to be available again, and both of them, in the time that remained, were richer for it. Crane used stories like this not to be sentimental, but to be specific. He believed that the abstract virtues, forgiveness, generosity, courage, humility, needed to be grounded in concrete human experience to be meaningful. Without the story, they were just words. With the story, they became possible. You could see how a real person had navigated a real situation and found a way through. And that visibility made the same thing feel achievable for you. In the later chapters of Resolve to Win, Crane turned to what he called the long view. He was concerned with the shape of an entire life, not just individual moments or decisions, but the arc, the trajectory, the story that would be told about you when it was all over. And more importantly, the story you would be able to tell yourself if you were honest. He believed that most people, at the end of a life, were not haunted primarily by the things they had done. They were haunted by the things they had not done. The risks not taken, the love not expressed, the apology never made, the dream never attempted. The person they could have been if they had been a little braver, a little more willing to fail in public, a little less concerned with what other people would think. The resolution to win, at this deepest level, is the resolution to live without that particular regret, to take the chances that matter, to say the important things while there is still time to say them, to attempt the things that excite you even when you are not certain you can succeed, because the attempt itself, the act of living towards something rather than away from something, is where the vitality lives. He wrote about courage at length, and again he was precise in a way that is useful. He distinguished between the kind of courage that is the absence of fear, which he thought was rare and possibly not even desirable, and the kind of courage that is action in the presence of fear. The second kind is available to everyone. It does not require that you feel no fear. It requires only that you feel the fear and act anyway, that you recognize the discomfort of uncertainty and move forward despite it, that you treat the racing heart and the dry mouth not as stop signs but as signs that something important is happening. He believed that every time you acted with this kind of courage, you made it slightly easier to do so again. That courage, like all character traits, was built through exercise. The person who had never done anything frightening did not thereby prove they were not afraid. They proved only that they had not yet discovered the capacity for courage that was available to them, and the cost of that undiscovery was a life lived within narrower boundaries than necessary. He told a story about a young man who had always wanted to speak publicly, who had ideas he believed in, who had something to say, but who was paralyzed by the fear of standing in front of others and being judged. For years he stayed silent. He watched other people, with fewer ideas and less preparation, take the stage while he remained in the audience. The frustration of this built over time into something close to bitterness. He began to resent the people who spoke not because they were better, but because they were braver, or at least because they had chosen action over comfort in a way he had not. Finally, at a community meeting about a local issue he cared about deeply, with no plan and no preparation, he stood up. His voice shook. His hands trembled. He said something. He was not entirely sure afterward what he had said, but he said it. And people listened. And when he sat down, something had changed. Not his fear, that was still there, but his relationship to his fear. He had learned that he could act in its presence, and from that day forward, his world was a little larger. Crane returned to this idea of enlargement again and again. The resolved life is the enlarging life. Every brave choice, every honest conversation, every new skill attempted, every unfamiliar idea engaged with seriously makes the world a little bigger. And the world of a person who is continuously enlarging their capacity and their engagement is a richer, more interesting, more satisfying place to live. He also wrote, with unusual candor for someone of his time, about the inner life of the spirit, not in a way that was narrowly religious, though his religious background was always present, but in a way that was broadly human. He believed that every person, regardless of their tradition or lack of one, had a dimension of experience that was not entirely explained by the practical and the material. That there were moments of beauty, of connection, of awe, of gratitude so deep it felt like more than gratitude, that pointed to something beyond the ordinary categories of daily life. And that attending to this dimension, honoring it, creating space for it, was essential to living well. He was not prescriptive about how you did this. For some people it was prayer, for others it was time in nature, for others it was music, or the experience of great art, or the practice of silence. The form did not matter to him as much as the fact of it. The fact of having some practice that reconnected you, regularly, to the larger dimensions of your experience. That reminded you that you were not simply a problem-solving machine but a conscious being in a world of extraordinary complexity and beauty. He saw the loss of this as one of the great impoverishments of modern life, the tendency to reduce everything to function, to treat every experience in terms of what it produced rather than what it was. The walk in the woods that became exercise, the meal that became fuel, the music that became background, the relationships that became networking, and the steady erosion, as a result, of the quality of experience that makes life feel like more than a series of tasks. The resolution to live with a kind of spiritual attentiveness was, for Crane, not a retreat from the world but a deeper engagement with it. The person who can be genuinely moved by the beauty of a sunset is not wasting time. They are practicing the kind of presence that makes all of life richer. They are keeping alive in themselves the capacity to be affected, which is one of the most important capacities a human being can have. Toward the very end of Resolve to Win, Crane wrote about what he called the final resolution, the resolution that underlies and makes possible all the others. And it was surprisingly simple. It was the resolution to believe that your life matters, Not in a grand historical sense necessarily, not in the sense that you will be remembered by millions or that your name will appear in books, but in the sense that what you do with your days is real, that the love you give is real, that the work you do is real, that the character you build through thousands of small decisions over the course of a long life is real, that it adds something to the world that would not be there without you. He believed that many people lived in a kind of existential uncertainty about this. They were not sure, at the deepest level, that they mattered, and from that uncertainty flowed a kind of passivity, a sense that effort was meaningless, that choices did not really matter, that the world would be more or less the same regardless of what they did or did not do. And this uncertainty, left unexamined, became a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the person who does not believe their choices matter does not make them with full intention, does not bring their full self to their own life. And so the life, unsurprisingly, feels hollow. The resolution Crane called for was the decision to act as if your life mattered, which is, in practice, the same as knowing that it does. To bring to your daily existence the same seriousness and care that you would bring to something you knew was important. To treat the people in your life as if they were worth your full attention, which they are. To treat the work you do as if it deserved your best effort, which it does. To treat yourself as if you were a person whose inner life was worth cultivating, which you are. This is, ultimately, what the book is about. Not strategies or tactics, not a list of resolutions to post on your refrigerator, but a fundamental shift in the way you relate to your own existence. A shift from passive to active, from reactive to intentional, from drifting to directed, from living by accident to living on purpose. Frank Crane knew that this shift is not made once and then permanent. He knew that it has to be made again and again, in small ways every day, in larger ways at the crossroads moments that every life contains. He knew that there will be mornings when the resolve feels thin, when the pull toward comfort and drift is stronger than the pull toward growth and engagement. He wrote not to shame you on those mornings, but to remind you that the resolution is always available to be renewed, that no drift is permanent, that no number of lost days means the rest of the days are lost too, that the story can change, not by pretending the past was different, but by deciding that the future will be. He ended with something that has stayed with readers across generations. The reminder that the question is not whether you will win or lose in the final accounting, because the final accounting is not yours to make. The question is whether you will have truly tried. Whether you will have brought your whole self, with all its imperfection and all its genuine capacity, to the effort of living a life that was worth living. Whether you will have loved, well, worked honestly, grown continuously, contributed something, and faced the days with more courage than fear. If you have done that, or even tried to do that, with real intention, then you have resolved to win. And in the most important sense, you already have. There is something powerful about sitting with a book like this, written more than a century ago, and finding that it still speaks so directly to the interior of your experience. Because the truth is that the fundamental questions of human life do not change very quickly. The technology changes, the circumstances change, the vocabulary changes. But the question of how to live, how to be a person of genuine character in a world that constantly tempts you toward something smaller, that question is as fresh today as it was when Frank Crane sat down to write about it. And the answer he gave, which was not flashy and not complicated, was that you resolve, you decide, you make the decision again and again to be the person you are capable of being. Not the perfect person, there is no perfect person. Not the person free of struggle and failure and doubt, there is no such person either. But the person who meets the struggle with intention, who learns from the failure with honesty, who holds the doubt and acts anyway. There is a quiet kind of strength in this. It does not require anything dramatic of you. It does not require a radical reinvention of your life or a sudden burst of inspiration. It requires only that you wake up tomorrow with a slightly clearer sense of what you are about and a slightly firmer decision to be about it. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. And so we bring this summary toward its close, not because there is nothing more to say, there is always more to say about a book this rich, but because the most important things have been said. Crane wanted his readers to leave his book not with their heads full of information, but with their hearts a little more engaged, with a feeling that the life they were living was worth giving their full attention to, with the quiet conviction that the decision to win, defined not by competitive victory but by genuine living, was available to them right now, in their current circumstances, with their current capacities. He wanted them to know that the resolved life is not a destination but a direction, that you do not arrive at it and then stop, that it is the ongoing act of choosing, daily, to engage with your own existence with intention and with care. If you take one thing from this summary, let it be this: The life you have is the one you get to work with. Not the one you imagined, not the one you might have had in different circumstances, not the one someone else appears to be living. This one. And this one, when you look at it honestly and engage with it fully, contains more possibility than you have probably allowed yourself to believe. Resolve to see it. Resolve to work with it. Resolve to make it, in whatever way is true and genuine for you, a life that you can look back on and feel, not that it was perfect, but that it was yours. That you showed up for it. That you tried. That is what Frank Crane was asking of his readers. It is what this summary has tried to invite from you. And it is, in the end, the most beautiful and the most human thing we can offer each other. The reminder that we are all capable of more than we settle for, and the encouragement to settle for less than that only when we have genuinely tried. Before we close completely, one last thought from Crane's deeper writing. He spoke often about the people we remember at the end of a long life, and what he found consistently was that the people we remember most vividly, the ones whose presence still feels warm years or decades after they have left us, are rarely the people who had the most. They are the people who gave the most, who were the most present, who made the most of what they had, who treated the people around them with the most genuine care, who faced their own difficulties with the most grace. These are not wealthy people necessarily. They are not famous people necessarily. They are, very often, entirely ordinary people in the eyes of the world who lived entirely extraordinary lives in the eyes of those who knew them. Because they had resolved, in their own way, to win. Not in the scoreboard sense, but in the deep, interior sense that Crane spent his life trying to describe. And they did win. Not despite their struggles, often because of them. You can do that too. You already know you can. What Crane was offering, and what this summary has tried to pass along, is the reminder that you know it, and the encouragement to live as if you mean it. And if this summary has given you something, if it has sparked something in you or reminded you of something you already knew but had temporarily misplaced, please like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It helps this channel reach more people who might need exactly what these ideas have to offer. Every like, every subscription, every share is a small act of generosity toward people you will never meet, but whose lives might be changed by encountering the right idea at the right moment. We are grateful for your support, and we do not take it lightly. The world is full of people who are one good idea away from turning something around. If this has been that idea for even one person who watched, it was worth every moment of the work that went into making it. Go live the resolved life. It has been waiting for you. And please, if you enjoyed this summary, take a look at our other videos on Audiobook Library. We have an entire library of summaries like this one. Books that have changed lives, ideas that have shaped people, stories that have opened doors for those who encountered them. Browse through what we have. Something there might be exactly what you are looking for next. We would love to have you come back and explore with us, and we hope that each time you do, you leave with something worth carrying into the rest of your day. Thank you for being here. And as Frank Crane would have said, in his quiet and certain way, go forward. There is a life worth living ahead of you, and you are more than capable of meeting it. Let us go back, because there is more here worth unwrapping. Frank Crane was not the kind of writer who said a thing once and considered the job done. He circled his ideas the way a careful craftsman walks around a piece of furniture he is building, examining it from every angle, testing every joint, making sure nothing is loose. And so we too will circle back, not to repeat but to go deeper. One of the things that made Crane's writing so durable across time was his understanding of human psychology at a level that most people of his era were only beginning to name. He did not have access to the vocabulary of modern psychology. He did not speak of cognitive distortions or unconscious patterns in the clinical language we now use. But he saw the same things those frameworks describe. He just saw them as a pastor and a writer sees them, through the lens of story and lived experience. He wrote, for example, about what he called the tyranny of the small mind, by which he meant the tendency of people to think about their lives in terms that were far too limited. Not limited by their actual circumstances, which were often difficult enough, but limited by their imaginations. He saw people who had genuine capacity living inside mental constructs that were far smaller than their actual dimensions, who had confined themselves, over years of listening to the wrong voices and telling themselves the wrong stories, into a corner of what was possible. The voices that did this damage were not always external. Often they were internal, the voice that says you are not the kind of person who does things like that. The voice that says that is not for people like you. The voice that reminds you of every previous failure as evidence that future effort is pointless. Crane saw these interior voices as, in a real sense, the greatest obstacle to human flourishing. Not poverty, not lack of education, not circumstance. The story you tell yourself about what you are capable of. He told the story of a woman from a small rural community who had grown up being told by parents who genuinely loved her that she was not particularly bright. It was not cruelty. It was their way of managing her expectations, of protecting her from disappointment. But the effect was that she moved through the first 3 decades of her life genuinely believing herself to be of limited intelligence. She held herself back from opportunities not because she lacked the capacity to seize them, but because she had been convinced she lacked it. And then, in her 30s, she took a job that required her to learn a new and complex skill. There was no one else to do it, so she had to. And she did. And the experience of doing it, of encountering her own competence in a domain she had never imagined herself capable in, was shattering in the best possible way. It broke open the story she had been living inside. And from that crack, light entered, and she began to see herself differently. The intelligence was always there. It had simply been waiting for permission to emerge. Crane used this kind of story to make a point about the way potential works. He believed that potential is not a fixed quantity that some people have and others do not. It is more like a landscape that becomes visible as you move through it. You cannot see what lies beyond the next ridge until you have climbed to it. And so the full scope of what you are capable of is genuinely unknown to you until you have pushed up against your current limits and discovered that they were not, after all, as fixed as you had assumed. This is not a comfortable idea for everyone. There is a certain security in believing that you already know what you are capable of, that the assessment has been made and the verdict is in, that you are working with a known quantity. The discomfort of discovering that the quantity is larger than you thought is also the discomfort of responsibility. Because if you are more capable than you believed, then you are also more responsible for what you do with that capacity. The person who genuinely cannot do better has a kind of peace. The person who discovers they can do better and chooses not to must live with that knowledge. Crane was willing to introduce this discomfort because he believed it was the necessary discomfort of growth. He was not interested in leaving his readers comfortable and unchanged. He was interested in leaving them more alive. And aliveness, as he understood it, was not a comfortable state. It was an engaged one. He wrote extensively about the relationship between honesty and courage, and he found in his years of observation that they were almost always inseparable. The honest life required courage, not once but constantly. It required the courage to see yourself clearly, the courage to admit mistakes, the courage to disagree when you believed you were right, even when disagreement was socially costly. The courage to say no to things that did not align with your values, even when saying yes would have been easier and more immediately rewarding. And conversely, he found that the courageous life required honesty. Because courage that is not grounded in honest self-assessment is not really courage, it is recklessness. It is the performance of bravery without the substance of it. Real courage knows what it is risking. It sees the difficulty clearly and chooses forward movement anyway. The clarity is part of what makes the movement brave. He wrote about a man who was known in his community for being fearless. He would say anything to anyone. He would challenge authority. He would take positions that were unpopular. But Crane looked more closely and saw that this man's apparent courage was actually a form of avoidance. He was brave in public and cowardly in private. He would challenge a stranger on a political question, but could not bring himself to have an honest conversation with his own wife about the state of their marriage. He would stand up at a town meeting and risk public disapproval, but could not risk the smaller, more intimate disapproval of the people who loved him and knew him. The performance of courage was, in his case, a substitute for the real thing. Real courage, Crane argued, is most often exercised in small private moments. The courage to look at yourself honestly in the quiet of the morning. The courage to stay in a difficult conversation rather than changing the subject. The courage to acknowledge when you have been wrong, in private, to the person you wronged. The courage to pursue the thing you care about even when no one is watching and no one will cheer. He was also deeply thoughtful about the nature of motivation. He saw 2 kinds of people in the world, broadly speaking. Those who were motivated primarily by what they were moving away from, pain, failure, shame, disapproval, and those who were motivated primarily by what they were moving toward, growth, connection, purpose, joy. Both kinds of motivation could produce movement, but Crane observed that the movement produced by the first kind, by the avoidance of pain, was characteristically different from the movement produced by the second kind. The person running away from something is always looking over their shoulder. The person running towards something is looking ahead. And this difference in orientation, which sounds small, produces cumulative effects over a lifetime. The person oriented towards something has a destination. Even if the destination changes, even if the path shifts, there is a direction. And direction sustained over time is what produces a life rather than a series of events. The person oriented away from something is just fleeing. And however fast they run, they carry with them the thing they are fleeing from, because it is inside them, not outside. He wrote about motivation in the context of work with particular clarity. He had observed that the most consistently productive and satisfied workers were rarely those who were most afraid of losing their jobs. They were those who were most interested in doing their jobs well. The anxiety of the first group was, paradoxically, often an obstacle to their performance. They were so focused on avoiding mistakes that they were too cautious to take the creative risks that would have made their work genuinely good. The second group, freed from that anxiety by the different quality of their motivation, could bring genuine engagement to the work rather than defensive competence. This distinction between creative engagement and defensive competence runs through a lot of what Crane wrote about work and achievement. Defensive competence, doing enough to avoid failure, is a miserable way to live. You are never more than one mistake away from the thing you fear, and so you are permanently on edge, permanently conservative, permanently limited by the size of your fear. Creative engagement, doing the work because you genuinely care how it turns out, is expansive. It can absorb failure, because failure is information rather than disaster. It can absorb criticism, because criticism is data that might help you do better. It produces a very different quality of experience and, over time, very different results. Frank Crane had watched enough people over enough years to know that these orientations were not fixed. You were not born into one or the other and stuck there. You could shift. It required awareness first and then intention. The awareness to notice which way you were oriented. The intention to choose differently. He wrote about the role of inspiration in this shift. He was cautious about inspiration, interestingly. He valued it but was suspicious of the idea that inspiration alone was enough to change a person. He had seen too many inspired moments that led to nothing, too many resolutions made in the heat of a good sermon, or a powerful book that dissolved within days of the inspiration passing. Inspiration, he said, was the spark, but you needed fuel, and fuel was habit, routine, the daily practice that kept the flame alive after the initial burst had faded. The person who is resolved to win needs inspiration, yes, the kind of vision and excitement that makes the effort feel worth it. But they also need the more pedestrian discipline of showing up on the days when there is no inspiration, when the feeling has passed and what remains is only the commitment. Crane called this integrity of effort, the ability to keep going when you no longer feel like it, which is, of course, the only time it really counts. He was specific about how you build this kind of integrity. You build it by starting with very small commitments and keeping them. Not grand resolutions, but modest ones. You will read for 20 minutes every morning. You will take a walk after dinner 3 times a week. You will write in a journal for 10 minutes before bed. These sound almost laughably small. But the point is not the activity. The point is the pattern. The point is demonstrating to yourself over and over again that you are the kind of person who does what they say they will do. That when you make a commitment to yourself, you honor it. This self-trust, built through small kept promises, is the foundation on which larger commitments can eventually be built. The person who cannot keep small promises to themselves will not suddenly become capable of keeping large ones. The capacity has to be developed. And it is developed in exactly the way Crane described, through incremental practice, through the daily exercise of small acts of integrity that accumulate into a character trait. He wrote about willpower in a way that is strikingly modern in its accuracy. He did not believe that willpower was a fixed reservoir that some people had more of than others. He believed it was a muscle, that it could be strengthened through use and weakened through disuse, that the person who made many small decisions in alignment with their values each day was training their capacity for larger decisions. And conversely, that the person who constantly overrode their own stated values in small matters was making themselves progressively less capable of following through on what mattered. He told a story about 2 students who were studying for an important examination. One of them, the one with what everyone described as greater willpower, had a simple secret. He had organized his environment so that the decisions that required willpower were as rare as possible. He went to the library to study because there were fewer distractions there. He told his friends in advance that he would be unavailable during certain hours so that the temptation to socialize did not need to be actively resisted. He kept his study materials visible and his distractions out of sight. He was not demonstrating superior willpower by doing this. He was demonstrating superior strategy. He was preserving his capacity for decision by making as few unnecessary decisions as possible. The other student, equally intelligent, equally capable, sat in his room trying to study while his entertainment was visible, while his friends were accessible. while every hour presented him with a series of small choices that depleted his capacity for the larger choice, which was to keep studying. He was not weaker, he was less organized, and the difference in outcomes was not a reflection of character but of structure. Crane drew from this a principle he applied broadly. The resolved life is one that is organized to support resolution. It is not simply a life in which someone has decided to be better and then tries harder. It is a life in which the environment, the habits, the daily structure, the social relationships are all aligned as much as possible with what that person is trying to become. When the environment fights your resolutions, the resolutions will usually lose. When the environment supports them, the resolutions can be sustained with far less effort. This is why he wrote so much about the importance of community, of surrounding yourself with people who shared your values or at least respected them. Not because you needed their approval, though approval is pleasant, but because the absence of constant friction is enormously enabling. The person who has to defend their commitment to growth every day at dinner against a partner who ridicules it is spending energy on defense that should be going into growth. The person whose environment normalizes their ambition and their habits has far more capacity available for the actual work. He was also deeply thoughtful about the management of energy, not in the modern wellness sense, though he would have recognized the concept, but in the sense of knowing when you were at your best and using those times for your most important work. He had observed that most people did their hardest thinking at the wrong time of day, either when they were too fresh to need it or too tired to benefit from it. And he thought this was a form of waste that accumulated over a lifetime into a significant loss of capacity. He advocated for knowing yourself well enough to know your own rhythms. Some people are sharpest in the first hours after waking. Others come alive in the afternoon. Some do their best creative work late at night. The content of the rhythm mattered less than the recognition of it, and the decision to honor it by doing the things that required your best self during the times when your best self was available. This sounds simple. It is, in principle. But in practice, it requires the kind of self-knowledge and self-management that most people never develop because they are too busy simply reacting to the demands of each day to notice their own patterns. Crane's invitation was to step back far enough to observe yourself, to become a thoughtful student of your own inner life, and to use what you learn to structure your time in alignment with your actual nature rather than in spite of it. He wrote about rest with equal seriousness. Rest was not, for Crane, the opposite of productive life. It was a component of it. The person who never fully rested was, over time, a person who was never fully alive. Because rest was not simply the absence of activity, it was the restoration of the capacity for activity. It was the fallow period between harvests that made the soil capable of producing again. And the person who denied themselves genuine rest in the name of productivity was, in Crane's view, engaged in a long-term transaction that would eventually bankrupt them. He saw this happen with people he admired, men and women of great capacity and genuine purpose who drove themselves past the point of sustainability in the service of goals that were worth pursuing, and who arrived years later at a kind of depletion that all the achievement in the world could not compensate for. They had won, by some measures, and lost in others, and the loss was of the kind that is very hard to recover from. His prescription was the same kind of intentionality he brought to everything else. Decide when you will rest. Protect that time. Treat it with the same seriousness you treat your work, because it is as important. Not guilty rest, not rest that is really just anxious inactivity while your mind churns. Real rest, the kind that restores. Whatever that means for you, whether it is sleep, or time in nature, or an evening of reading that has nothing to do with anything useful, or a long meal with people you love, or the particular quiet of a Sunday afternoon with nothing scheduled. Find it, honor it, make it as regular and as non-negotiable as anything else you do. Crane wrote about pleasure and enjoyment with a tenderness that is one of the most appealing qualities of his writing. He was not a stern moralist. He did not believe that virtue required the suppression of joy. He believed, if anything, that genuine virtue made joy more available, not less. That the person who lived with integrity had cleaner access to pleasure than the person who did not, because there was no shadow of self-reproach to dim the experience. He wrote about the pleasures of the body with respect, the pleasure of good food eaten with attention, of physical movement that was engaged rather than obligatory, of rest that was genuine rather than guilty. He wrote about the pleasures of the mind with delight, the pleasure of a good argument followed to its conclusion, of a new idea that reorganized everything around it, of a book that made you think in a way you had never thought before. He wrote about the pleasures of the heart with the deepest feeling, the pleasure of love given and received, of being known and knowing, of the particular warmth of a friendship that has survived time and difficulty, and is richer for having done so. All of these, he believed, were part of the winning life, not rewards for having worked hard enough, not treats to be earned, but dimensions of a life that was being fully inhabited. The person who is resolved to win is resolved to experience their own life with full presence and full appreciation, and this includes the capacity to be delighted, to be moved, to be surprised, to laugh at the right moments, to weep at the right ones, to be affected by the world rather than defended against it. He told a story about a professor he had known, a man of extraordinary intellectual accomplishment, whose work had been published and praised and who had shaped the thinking of generations of students. But this man had something like an allergy to emotion. He had trained himself over decades of academic rigor to be suspicious of feeling. He valued analysis. He valued precision. He was genuinely uncomfortable in the presence of anything that could not be reasoned about. And as a result, though his career was by any measure distinguished, his life was curiously flat. He was present for the intellectual experiences and absent from almost everything else. His relationships were functional rather than warm. His home was orderly rather than alive. His leisure time was structured and productive rather than genuinely restful. And when, near the end of his life, someone asked him what he had most enjoyed, he had to think for a very long time before answering. And what he finally said was revealing, not the accomplishments he listed, but a single afternoon he described almost shyly, an afternoon when his grandson, a small boy then, had fallen asleep on his shoulder during a car journey and had stayed there for 2 hours while the professor sat very still, not moving, not wanting to disturb him. That afternoon, he said, was the one he returned to most often. Crane would have understood this story as a small tragedy and a small redemption. A small tragedy because the professor had spent decades defending himself against exactly the kind of experience he treasured most. A small redemption because, even at the end, the capacity was still there. The sleeve had been worn through, and the warmth had leaked out. It is never entirely too late. He believed this, genuinely. He had seen people change late in life, not dramatically, not in ways that undid the cost of years of patterns, but in ways that mattered. People who softened after decades of hardness, people who opened after decades of closure, people who finally said the thing they had been unable to say for 30 years and found that, miraculously, it was not too late to be heard. He was not naive about the limits of late change. He knew that patterns established over long periods of time have deep roots and cannot be pulled up easily. He knew that the years between 30 and 50 are in many ways the most formative, the years when the habits and character that will define the final decades are being solidified. He argued, accordingly, for beginning early, not because late was impossible, but because early was better, because the life you wanted to look back on with satisfaction needed to be built over time, and time was the one resource you could not manufacture or replace. This urgency was not meant to induce anxiety. Crane was explicitly worried about the kind of urgency that paralyzes rather than motivates, the anxiety of, I should have started sooner, I have wasted so much time, it is probably too late for me now. He had seen this anxiety in people who were, in fact, still quite early in their lives, who had interpreted a few years of drift as permanent damage. He wanted them to understand that the past was truly past, that it could not be changed, and that spending energy lamenting it was spending energy that belonged to the future. His counsel was consistent and clear. Begin where you are, not where you wish you had begun, not where you plan to begin, where you actually are with what you actually have on the actual day that it actually is. The resolved life does not wait for better conditions. It begins in whatever conditions exist, because those conditions are the only ones that are real, and the life that waits for perfection before beginning never begins at all. He wrote about this with an image that has stayed with readers across generations. He compared the person waiting for perfect conditions to begin their real life to a traveler who would not start a journey until the weather was certain to be fine the whole way. He would wait forever. Because the weather is never certain, the road is never guaranteed to be smooth, the conditions are never going to be exactly right. The journey begins in uncertain weather, on an imperfect road, with incomplete information, or it does not begin at all. And here is what Crane had observed about that journey. Once you begin, once you take the actual first step, something shifts. The uncertainty that seemed paralyzing from the position of not having started becomes manageable from the position of having started. Because you are no longer in the abstract territory of what might go wrong. You are in the concrete territory of what is actually happening, and you are finding that you can deal with it. Your capacities, which seemed insufficient when you were measuring them against the whole imagined journey, turn out to be more than enough for the one actual step in front of you. And then the next step, and the step after that. And before you know it, You have traveled a distance that would have seemed impossible from where you started. Not because you were more capable than you thought, though you were, but because you were willing to begin. And beginning, Frank Crane believed, was the thing that most distinguished the people who lived well from the people who didn't. Not talent, not luck, not circumstance, the willingness to begin. He returned to this theme in the final pages of his book, bringing it full circle in a way that repays attention. He wrote that the resolution to win was not a single dramatic act. It was not the moment of revelation or the turning point in the story. It was a practice, a daily renewal of an intention. And the secret of the people who sustained that practice over the full arc of a life was not that they were stronger or more determined or more gifted than others. It was that they had found a way to make the renewal feel natural rather than forced. They had aligned their habits in their environment and their community with their intentions so thoroughly that the resolution was less an act of willpower and more an expression of who they were. This is character. This is what Crane meant by character, not the dramatic choice in a moment of crisis, though that matters. The small daily choices that, added together across a lifetime, become the person you are. The person who tells the truth even when it is slightly inconvenient. The person who keeps the appointment even when skipping it would be easy. The person who listens when they would rather talk. The person who looks for what is good in people and situations rather than what is lacking. The person who maintains their resolution not because they are forcing themselves to, but because they have chosen it often enough that it is now genuinely who they are. That transformation, from resolution to character, from decision to identity, from trying to being, is the full arc of what Resolve to Win describes. It is a long arc. It does not complete itself in a week or a month or even a year. It is the work of a life, but it is, Crane believed, the most worthwhile work available to a human being. Because its product is not any external achievement, however impressive. Its product is a self that you can inhabit with dignity and with satisfaction. A self that is, in the deepest sense, your own. There is a particular quality of peace that comes to people who have lived this way. Not the peace of having everything figured out, which is not available to anyone. Not the peace of having avoided difficulty, which is also not available. But the peace that comes from knowing that you have lived with intention, that you have tried, honestly and continuously, to be the person you believed yourself capable of being. That you have shown up for your own life, for the people you love, for the work that mattered to you, with as much of yourself as you could bring. Frank Crane wanted this for his readers. He wanted it with a kind of pastoral warmth that comes through even across the distance of a century. He cared about people. He cared about their flourishing. And he believed, with a depth that was not easily shaken, that human beings were capable of more than they usually gave themselves credit for. That the life most people were living was a smaller version of the life they were capable of living. And that the door between those two lives was not locked. It was only, most of the time, not yet tried. Try it. That is what he was saying. That is what this summary has been saying, in its way. The door is there. The resolution is available. The resolved life, with all its imperfections and all its genuine satisfactions, with all its difficulty and all its beauty, is waiting for you on the other side. Go through the door. And as you do, remember that you are not alone in going through it. Every person who has ever resolved to live better, to try harder, to be more honest, to love more fully, to show up more consistently, is, in some sense, traveling with you. The human project of becoming is a shared one. We are all in it together, however solitary it sometimes feels, and the person who goes through the door makes it a little easier for the next person to see that it can be done. That, too, is part of the winning life. Not just winning for yourself, but making it possible for others to see that winning is possible, being the evidence, being the story someone else tells when they need to believe that change is real, that growth happens, that it is not too late, that effort matters, that the door can be opened. Be that story. Live that life. Resolve to win, in Frank Crane's understanding of those words, which is the deepest and most human understanding of them. And then do it. Not perfectly, not without stumbling, not all at once, but with intention, with honesty, with continuity, and with the quiet, sustaining belief that the effort is worth it. It is worth it. And with that, as we truly bring this to a close, if this has given you something worth carrying, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. Share it with someone who might need these ideas today. And please, take a look through our channel. We have many more summaries like this one, books that deserve to be heard, ideas that deserve to be passed along. We would love to see you there. Thank you for spending this time with us. It has been genuinely a pleasure. There is one more dimension of Frank Crane's thinking that deserves its own time and space. And it is perhaps the one that is most relevant to the particular pressures of the world we live in now. It is what he wrote about the noise of opinion, about the constant presence of other people's judgments, and about the extraordinary difficulty of knowing your own mind in the midst of all that sound. Crane wrote in an era that was, by our standards, quiet. There was no social media, there was no 24-hour news cycle, there were no platforms designed by teams of engineers to capture your attention and hold it through a combination of outrage, flattery, and social comparison. And yet, even in that quieter world, he saw how easily a person's sense of themselves could be overwhelmed by the opinions of others, how quickly a person could lose touch with what they actually thought and felt in the presence of a loud collective voice telling them what to think and feel. He believed that one of the essential disciplines of the resolved life was what he called the maintenance of an inner life, by which he meant the deliberate cultivation of a space inside yourself that was yours alone, that was not constantly subjected to external noise, that was allowed to develop its own judgments and its own responses to the world without first checking what others thought. This was not the same as closed-mindedness. He was not suggesting that you ignore other people's perspectives or refuse to update your views in the light of new information. He was suggesting that you develop enough of a relationship with your own thinking that you could evaluate other perspectives from a position of genuine interiority rather than from a position of empty receptivity. The person with no inner life is a vessel waiting to be filled. Whatever the loudest voice in the room says, whatever opinion seems most socially advantageous to hold, whatever the crowd appears to believe, flows in and fills the vessel and becomes, temporarily, that person's view. Until the next loud voice or advantageous opinion arrives. This is not how Crane described it exactly, because he was too kind to describe anyone so harshly. But it is what he was pointing at, the danger of living entirely in the echo of other people's thinking. He wrote about the practice of solitude as the antidote to this. Not the solitude of isolation, not the withdrawal from human connection, which he valued deeply, but the solitude of regular time spent in your own company, with your own thoughts, without the constant interruption of other voices. Time to read and to reflect. Time to sit quietly and let your own responses to things surface without being immediately overwritten. Time to know what you actually think, before you know what you are supposed to think. He had observed that the people who were clearest in their values and most consistent in their behavior were often people who had a strong practice of this kind of solitude. They were not necessarily introverts. Some of the most socially engaged people he knew were also the most intentional about their time alone. But they had learned that engagement with the world was most valuable when it came from a self that was whole, not from a self that was continuously reassembling itself from whatever the social environment provided. He told the story of a judge he had known, a man of considerable public responsibility, who had a practice of walking for an hour every morning before his working day began. Not to exercise, though that was a benefit, not to think through the specific problems of the day, though sometimes that happened, but simply to be alone with himself in a way that was rarely possible once the day was underway. To let his own mind organize itself without agenda. To be, for that 1 hour, simply a person moving through the world with no particular obligation except to be present to it. He said, when people asked about it, that those morning hours were the source of most of the clarity he brought to his work. Not the specific thinking done during them, but the quality of presence they produced. The readiness, the sense of knowing who he was before the day began telling him who to be. Crane was moved by this. He saw it as an example of what he called prepared living, the practice of arriving at the moments of your life with something to bring, rather than simply responding to whatever was asked of you with whatever happened to be available. The prepared person has thought in advance about what they value and how they want to behave. They are not working out their principles in the heat of the moment, which is the hardest time to think clearly. They have done the thinking earlier, in the quiet, and arrive at the moment with a readiness that looks, from the outside, like wisdom. He wrote about wisdom, actually, at considerable length, and he was careful to distinguish it from intelligence, from education, from experience. He had known very intelligent people who were not wise, very well-educated people who were not wise, people who had lived long and seen much who were not wise. Wisdom, as he understood it, was a particular quality of engagement with life that combined several things at once. It combined honesty, the willingness to see things as they were. It combined humility, the recognition of the limits of one's own understanding. It combined patience, the ability to resist the pressure for immediate certainty. And it combined care, a genuine concern for the well-being of others that tempered self-interest without eliminating it. This combination was rare, but Crane believed it was cultivatable. He believed that wisdom was not a gift you either had or did not have. It was a quality that could be developed slowly through the right kind of living, through the practice of paying attention, through the willingness to learn from your mistakes rather than explaining them away, through the habit of listening more than talking, of seeking to understand before seeking to be understood, through the long, patient practice of treating other people as genuinely real, as having inner lives as complex and valid as your own. This last point was something Crane returned to with unusual frequency. He was troubled by the ease with which people reduced other people to simple categories, to supporting cast members in the story of their own life rather than protagonists in their own. He saw this in the way people talked about those they disagreed with, flattening them into caricatures rather than engaging with the actual complexity of their positions. He saw it in the way people talked about those who worked for them or served them, not seeing them as full human beings with their own stories and struggles and aspirations. He believed that this reduction, this failure of genuine attention to other people, was both morally impoverished and practically costly. Morally impoverished because it failed to honor the reality of other people's humanity. Practically costly because the person who sees others clearly has access to a much richer understanding of the world than the person who sees only what confirms their existing categories. Every person, Crane argued, is carrying knowledge that you do not have. Every person has experienced things you have not experienced and understood things you have not understood. To dismiss them, to categorize and discard them without genuine engagement, is to cut yourself off from a source of learning that is both rich and irreplaceable. He told a story about a scholar who had spent his entire career studying a particular period of history. He had read every text, consulted every archive, built the most sophisticated understanding of that period available to anyone alive. And then, in his later years, he met an elderly woman who had grown up in a family that had preserved oral histories from that same period, stories that had never been written down, details that no archive had captured, and everything he thought he knew was not overturned exactly, but enriched and complicated in ways that no amount of additional textual research could have provided. The woman had knowledge he could not have gotten any other way, and he had almost not taken the conversation seriously, because she was not an academic, and he had learned over many years to weight academic sources most heavily. He was grateful he had listened. He said afterward that the conversation had changed his understanding of his own field in ways that would take him years to fully integrate. And Crane used this to make the broader point that our categories of who is worth listening to, who has knowledge worth seeking, are often far too narrow. That the world is full of people carrying wisdom in forms that do not look like wisdom from the outside. And that the resolved person, the person who is genuinely committed to understanding things as they are rather than as they would like them to be, is the person who can be surprised, who can be taught by unexpected teachers, who remains across the whole of a life genuinely open to the possibility that they have more to learn. He connected this to what he wrote about aging. He had watched people age in very different ways, some becoming richer and more interesting as the decades passed, others becoming more rigid, more repetitive, more confined. And the difference, as he saw it, was not primarily biological, it was attitudinal. The people who aged well were those who had maintained the habit of openness, of curiosity, of willingness to encounter the new. The people who aged less well were those who had decided at some point that they had already done the important learning, and that what remained was simply the application of what they knew. He saw this decision, this closing of the mind to new input, as a kind of premature death. The person was still alive in a biological sense, but something essential had ended. The quality of engagement that made life feel genuinely inhabited had faded, and in its place was a going through of motions, a repetition of familiar patterns, a gradual narrowing of the world to the size of what was already known. The resolution he called for, the one he believed was essential to a life that remained alive until its very end, was the resolution to stay interested in the world, in other people, in the questions you had not yet answered, in the areas of knowledge you had not yet entered, in the possibilities you had not yet imagined. To treat curiosity not as a childish trait to be grown out of, but as one of the most sophisticated and essential human capacities, one that required active cultivation rather than passive preservation. He wrote about his own curiosity with a kind of delight that was infectious. He was interested in everything. He would read about astronomy one week and about carpentry the next. He would have a conversation with a theologian in the morning and with a street vendor in the afternoon and find them equally interesting. He was not dilettantish about this. He did not mistake broad interest for genuine understanding. But he believed that the breadth of his engagement with the world made him better at everything, including the things he knew most deeply. Because every encounter with a different way of thinking, a different body of knowledge, a different human experience, added something to the way he understood the world and the people in it. He wanted his readers to feel the permission that he had given himself, the permission to be interested in things that had no obvious practical application, the permission to read a book simply because it seemed fascinating, the permission to have a conversation that wandered wherever it wanted to wander, the permission to take seriously the questions that had no definitive answers, the philosophical questions, the spiritual questions, the questions about how to live that had occupied human minds since the first human mind was capable of being occupied by them. These questions, Crane believed, were not luxuries, they were necessities. The person who never engaged with the question of what a good life looked like was living without a map. They were making choices, thousands of choices a day, about how to spend their time and energy and attention, without any guiding sense of what those choices were in service of. This was, in his view, a kind of poverty that had nothing to do with material resources and everything to do with the absence of reflection. The examined life, as he understood it, was not the life of a philosopher in the technical sense. It was the life of anyone who took their own existence seriously enough to think about it. Anyone who asked themselves, with some regularity, whether the way they were living was the way they actually wanted to live. Anyone who was willing to sit with discomfort long enough to understand what it was telling them. Anyone who treated the experience of their own life as data worth examining, rather than simply as something to be endured or enjoyed without understanding. He believed that this kind of reflection was not something that came naturally to most people. The pressure of daily life was always toward the immediate, toward the next task and the next obligation and the next need. The pull toward reflection required a kind of counter-movement, a deliberate stepping back that was not easy to sustain, but he believed it was essential. Because without it, a person could spend their entire life doing things without knowing why they were doing them, could spend decades in a marriage or a career or a community without ever having genuinely chosen any of it, having simply drifted into it and then stayed because leaving required more initiative than staying. The person who has reflected, who has examined, who has asked the questions and sat with the difficulty of the answers, is the person who can genuinely choose. And genuine choice, freely made with full awareness, is the basis of a life that feels owned rather than borrowed, the life that you have actually decided to live rather than the life that happened to you. Crane was clear that this examination was not a one-time event. It was not a retreat or a period of reflection after which everything would be settled and you could proceed with confidence. It was an ongoing practice. The questions changed as you changed. The answers that satisfied you at 30 were not always the ones that satisfied you at 50. The life worth living looked different at different stages, and the person who was paying attention noticed this and responded to it, rather than trying to live at 50 by the answers they had reached at 30. He wrote about this in the context of what he called the great transitions of life, the moments when one chapter ended and another, necessarily different, began. Marriage and its deepening, parenthood and its radical reorientation of priorities, the loss of a parent, which closed a door and opened a new kind of responsibility. The passage into midlife, which brought with it a more acute sense of finitude and a more pressing question about what remained undone. The movement into later years, which required a different kind of courage and a different relationship to what mattered. Each of these transitions was, for Crane, both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because it required letting go of what had been and building a relationship with what was coming. An opportunity because it forced a kind of renewed examination, a fresh asking of the question, what do I actually want my life to be? How do I want to live in this new chapter? He believed that the people who navigated these transitions most gracefully were those who had maintained, throughout their lives, the habit of reflection. They were not strangers to themselves when the transition arrived. They had been paying attention to their own evolving needs and values and capacities, and so the change, though often still painful, was not accompanied by the additional disorientation of meeting yourself as a stranger at a crucial moment. He wrote about the transition into later life with particular tenderness. He saw it as a stage that our culture systematically misunderstood, treating it primarily as loss, as diminishment, as the beginning of an ending. And while he was honest about the real losses of aging, the physical ones especially, he believed that later life, at its best, held something that earlier life did not. A particular quality of perspective, a capacity for appreciation that came from having lived long enough to know what was truly rare and what was truly ordinary. A freedom from the anxious striving of earlier years that made possible a different quality of presence. He knew people in their 70s and 80s who were, in the most important ways, more alive than they had been in their 40s. Not more energetic, not more productive in the conventional sense, but more present, more grateful, more capable of genuine connection, because they had stopped trying to become and were simply being, had stopped looking over their shoulder at the competition and simply looking at what was in front of them with clear and appreciative eyes. He found this inspiring. Not because he was romantic about old age, he was too honest for that, but because it suggested that the qualities most worth cultivating in life, the qualities of genuine presence and genuine gratitude and genuine connection, were available across the whole span of a life, and perhaps most fully available at the end. This was, in the end, one of his deepest convictions, that the winning life was not front-loaded, was not primarily for the young and the energetic and the capable of maximum output. It was available to anyone, at any age, in any circumstance, who was willing to bring their actual self into genuine contact with their actual life, who was willing to stop waiting for better conditions or a different situation or a more convenient time, and begin, right here, with what was real. Crane's book closes not with triumph, but with something quieter and more lasting. It closes with the image of a person who has lived well, not perfectly, not without failure, not without loss, but with intention, and with honesty, and with love, sitting in the gathering of years and feeling not satisfaction exactly, but something close to it. Something that in older languages might have been called peace. The peace of a person who has tried, who has cared, who has shown up for the things that mattered, who has used their days in the service of something beyond the merely convenient. That peace, Crane believed, was available to everyone who resolved to seek it, not by arriving at it, but by living toward it, not by achieving it, but by choosing every day the kind of actions and the kind of attention that moved you in its direction. That is the summary of Resolve to Win, not a list of strategies, not a program for success, a philosophy of living, offered by a man who cared deeply about the human beings who would read it, who believed in them perhaps more than they believed in themselves, and who wanted, more than anything, to give them the vocabulary and the encouragement to become what he could see they were already capable of being. Thank you, Frank Crane, for writing it, and thank you, listener, for sitting with it long enough to let it speak. Please take a moment now, if this has meant something to you, to like this video and to subscribe to Audiobook Library. It costs you nothing and gives this channel the ability to keep growing, keep finding these important books, keep bringing these ideas to people who need them. Share this with someone in your life who is at a crossroads, who is looking for something to hold on to, who might find in Crane's words the same encouragement you found. And please explore our channel. We have so many more summaries waiting for you, books about resilience and courage and the quiet art of living well, books that have changed lives and that might change yours. Browse through what we have built here. We think you will find something worth your time. We are grateful for every moment you spend with us, and we are always working to make it worth your while. Go forward. The resolved life is waiting. And because there is always one more thing worth saying about a book this rich, let us linger just a moment longer on something Crane embedded near the heart of his writing, something so quietly stated that it is easy to miss the first time through, and yet so essential that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. He believed that the way you talk to yourself matters more than almost anything else in your life, not in a superficial affirmation sense, not the recitation of slogans you do not quite believe, but in the deep, structural sense of the story you tell yourself about who you are and what you are doing here and whether it matters. Every person is carrying a narrative about themselves. Most of the time, this narrative runs in the background, like software that is always open and always running, shaping every decision and every response and every moment of courage or failure of courage without ever being examined. Crane believed that examining this narrative, and when necessary revising it, was one of the most important things a person could do, not by forcing yourself to feel differently than you feel, not by covering the hard parts with positive thinking, but by genuinely asking whether the story was accurate, whether the beliefs embedded in it were actually true, or whether they were inherited assumptions adopted early and never questioned since. He had seen people living inside stories that were not true, stories that said they were not the kind of person who deserved good things, stories that said any success they had achieved was somehow unearned or accidental, stories that said that things they wanted were not really for them, that there was some category they belonged to that excluded them from the life they wanted. And he had seen, with his own eyes, what happened when someone finally questioned those stories and found them wanting, the relief of it, the strange, disorienting, beautiful liberation of discovering that the walls were not load-bearing, that they could come down, that the sky did not fall when they did. He wrote about a young man he had counseled who had grown up in a family defined by a particular kind of struggle. Not poverty exactly, but a persistent sense of barely managing, of always being one bad month away from serious trouble. This sense had become so deeply embedded in his thinking that even as his actual circumstances improved, as he built a career and a home and a family of his own, the feeling of precariousness never fully left him. He worried constantly. He could not enjoy what he had because he was always bracing for the moment it would be taken away. The prosperity was real, but the experience of it was shadowed by a story that had been written in a harder time and never updated. When Crane finally got him to examine this story, to look at it directly and ask whether it was still accurate, the young man was almost angry, because examining it meant acknowledging how much it had cost him. How many years of genuine good fortune he had spent in unnecessary dread. How much of his children's childhoods he had been present for in body and somewhere else in mind, running the anxious calculations of a person who does not believe the safety is real. But anger, Crane knew, was part of the process. The anger was productive. It was the anger of someone who had seen the bars of their cage and realized they were not, after all, made of iron. That they were made of something much softer, and that the door had been open all along. The young man changed, slowly, not all at once, with setbacks and backsliding and days when the old story rushed back in. But the direction changed, and direction, sustained across enough time, is what becomes a life. Crane was telling this story not to give anyone a formula. He knew there was no formula. The specific work of examining your own narrative and revising what was false in it is inherently individual. No one can do it for you, and no book can tell you exactly what you will find or exactly what to do with it. But Crane believed that knowing the work was possible, knowing that others had done it and been changed by it, was itself a form of encouragement that was worth offering. He believed in encouragement with an almost fierce commitment. He had seen what happened to people in the absence of it, how the lack of someone believing in you, genuinely and specifically, could hollow out even the most capable person over time. How the presence of it could sustain effort through years of difficulty that might otherwise have broken it. He took seriously his responsibility, as a writer and as a minister, to be a source of that belief. To say, to the people who read him, in the clearest and most honest terms he could find, that they were more capable than they knew, that the life they wanted was more possible than they believed, and that the distance between where they were and where they could be was shorter than it appeared, and was crossed, not by a single leap, but by a long sequence of small steps, each one chosen deliberately. That is the final word, really, of everything Crane wrote. Deliberateness, the practice of choosing rather than drifting, the practice of bringing your awareness and your intention to bear on the daily material of your existence rather than letting it simply happen to you. This is not a dramatic call to arms. It is something quieter. It is an invitation to take your own life seriously, to treat it as something worth shaping, to believe, with enough conviction to act on it, that the shape you give it matters, not to history, not necessarily to the wider world, but to you and to the people whose lives touch yours, to the quality of the days you will have lived when the days are done. That belief, held steadily and acted on consistently, is what Crane meant by resolution. And the life built on that foundation, imperfect and unfinished as every human life is what he meant by winning. The resolution is yours. The winning is yours. Go claim it with the patience and the honesty and the daily recommitment it requires. And know, as you do, that every person who has ever tried to live well is in some sense with you. That you are part of a long human story of people who looked at their lives and decided, again and again, that they could be more fully lived. You are not the first. You will not be the last. But you are here, now, in this moment, with this chance. And that is everything. That is, in the end, enough. One thing Crane wrote that we have not yet fully honored is his thinking about the relationship between ambition and contentment, because he saw these as the two poles between which every person had to find their own particular balance, and he believed that most people fell too far in one direction or the other. The person who falls too far toward ambition loses the present to the future. They are always in the next moment, the next achievement, the next level, and so the current moment, with all its actual texture and warmth and life, passes through them unregistered. They arrive at success, if they arrive, and find that it tastes like nothing in particular, because they were never really in any of the moments that added up to it. They were always somewhere else. The person who falls too far toward contentment loses the future to the present. They settle for what is before they have genuinely tried for what could be. They mistake comfort for satisfaction. They confuse the absence of striving with the presence of peace, and something in them, the part that knows they have not fully tried, keeps a low and persistent account of what has not been attempted. Crane believed the balance between these two was the ongoing work of a lifetime. Not a fixed point you arrived at and maintained, but a dynamic equilibrium that required constant small adjustments. There were seasons for leaning toward ambition and seasons for leaning toward rest. There were chapters that called for intense forward movement and chapters that called for consolidation and appreciation of what had been built. The wisdom was in reading which chapter you were in and responding accordingly. He wrote that the person who could do this, who could push hard when pushing was called for and rest genuinely when rest was called for, who could desire growth without being enslaved to it and enjoy what was without being paralyzed by it, was the person living closest to the full range of what human life offered. They were, in his word, winning, not because they had reached any particular place, but because they were navigating with skill and intention and joy. That navigation, moment by moment, day by day, across the full arc of a life, was Frank Crane's definition of the good life. Not a destination, a way of traveling, with eyes open, with heart engaged, with the resolution renewed as often as necessary to be genuinely, fully, honestly here. That is the book. That is the man. That is the invitation. And one more time, warmly and sincerely, please like and subscribe to Audiobook Library if this summary has given you something worth carrying. Please check out our other videos on the channel. We have a growing library of summaries just like this one, and we would love to have you come back. Every view, every subscription, every share helps this community grow, and it is a community worth growing. Thank you for being part of it. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. It means more than you know.